Welcome, everyone. My name is Tom Law, and I'm the Head of Policy and Learning at the Global Forum for Media Development. On behalf of GFMD and our friends and partners at the Centre for International Media Assistance, we are very pleased to welcome you to this meeting of GFMD Impact, our international media policy and advisory centre, which brings together donors, practitioners, researchers, and others in the field of media development to build the evidence base for our sector and to be a catalyst for collaboration and learning. This afternoon, we're going to hear from around 20 speakers. As you'll see from the list of organizations we're going to hear from today, I hope you'll agree that we are fulfilling our ambition in bringing together the sector. Before we begin our program, I would like to thank the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Estonian Institute of Human Rights for their excellent support in organizing today. I would also like to thank our co-conveners for today's session, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, and the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, as well as UNESCO. You'll be hearing from all of those organizations over the next two sessions. A quick thanks as well to the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC, who are providing the core support for the GFMD Impact Initiative. Also, I'd like to thank quickly our core supporters at GFMD, the National Endowment for Democracy and Open Society Foundations, as well as for support for today's sessions from Germany's Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, I'd like to turn for a quick introduction to the chair of GFMD, Zoe Titus, who is the director of the Namibian Media Institute. Zoe.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tom, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm very grateful not to have to do this via Zoom, an opportunity to introduce the Global Forum for Media Development for the first time in face in my capacity as chairperson of the GFMD. And particularly the work that we have been doing in the area of media sustainability. I assumed this position just a few months ago in September last year, and I'm pleased to acknowledge fellow members of the executive committee, Jan Lubinski from Deutsche Welle and Ruth Cronenberg of Free Press Unlimited. I, as Tom has indicated, am from Namibia, the Namibia Media Trust, and I thought to share that with you specifically, to give you insight into both the reach of the GFMD and its commitment to inclusivity. Presently, the GFMD comprises more than 100 media organizations, media development and journalism support organizations who shape and give impetus to our mandate, which is to promote and deliver policies and programs to sustain journalism as a public good. From its inception, the GFMD has advocated for increased understanding, recognition, and importance of journalism support and media development within international corporate, donor, philanthropic, and intergovernmental communities. And that is why we are here today, to speak frankly about the existential crisis facing journalism today. The news business has collapsed and it holds dire consequences for our democracies. Local news organizations continue to shrink and collapse. Vulnerable media translates into vulnerable journalists, translates ultimately into vulnerable citizens. Democracies need independent, fact-based journalism to provide a voice for a diverse range of people, to watchdog the powerful, and to keep members of society informed. Study after study has found that without access to verified, trusted news, people are less engaged and less likely to make informed decisions. It is in this context that the GFMD has leveraged its strengths the ability to convene a broad range of stakeholders, to consult, to discuss, to agree, to disagree, and to chart an evidence-based approach to this global crisis. This is a kind of approach that ensures local ownership of our actions and, most importantly, its efficacy. So thank you for joining us today. We look forward to your insights.
Thank you, Zoe. I'd now like to ask Guido de Souza, the Chief of Freedom and Expression and Safety of Journalists section at UNESCO, who is also one of our co-conveners for today, to say a few words.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for actually inviting UNESCO to convene this meeting. We have no doubt in UNESCO that this issue of media viability is one of the most important topics for freedom of expression that we are currently facing in the world. Since the United Nations system was created more than 7 decades ago, we actually concentrated in 3 main issues that Zoe already mentioned: how we foster and consolidate democracies, how we protect human rights, and how we can have a better development process. If you think of all those 3 areas carefully, you will find examples of journalists and journalism doing watchdog, inform the population with context and accuracy, and also setting the agenda about those topics. And if we believe that this is true, this institution should survive, should not only survive, should be empowered to perform this fundamental role in this process of checks and balances. Right now, this institution is suffering. And if we don't do something, and we don't do something quickly, we are actually not only facing the risk to jeopardize journalism, but we are facing the risk to jeopardize democracy, human rights protection, and sustainable development processes. So for UNESCO, it's a pleasure to be here. We need to keep this ball rolling. And as the Nobel Literature Prize, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, once said, this is the best work in the world, journalism. So what we do to protect them. Thank you.
Thank you, Guilherme. Now, as part of GFMD Impact, we really always try and ensure that we're not starting from scratch. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And so before these meetings, we always put together a review of the literature on this subject. And to do that for us today, to introduce some of the highlights, I'd like to hopefully invite our Executive Director, Mira Milosevic, to join us via video link. Over to you, Mira.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all in the room and online for joining us today. Finding a key to sustainability of media and journalism is somewhat, as Zoe and Guilherme has just mentioned, a holy grail in the media development and journalism support field. After years of digital disruption, even journalism and media industry themselves are still looking for new models for sustaining journalism. And this is the thread that's apparent in the recent research and reports that are all published with a specific aim of identifying challenges to media sustainability and potential responses. And many of them state that we lack clear definition of sustainability in the media development field. And this has been highlighted by some of the practitioners as an obstacle to understanding what works and what does not. And if you add to that question how sustainability is defined and measured at a wider international development stage, and then on top of that, place all of this in the context of sustainable development goals, things start getting even more complicated. And this simple thing is what I will try to unpack in only 5 following minutes. I don't know if you can see my presentation. Yes, thank you so much. So let's start from the international development stage angle. So where does this notion of sustainability comes from? And here you can see what the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, has introduced already in 1991. And this has become an inevitable standard for all development projects, looking at everything from efficiency to sustainability. And sustainability has evolved in terms of which layer we're looking at. So from looking at sustaining a process, the focus shifted to sustaining a project. And finally, sustainability is defined in this OECD DAC framework as the likelihood that the effects of an intervention will continue after it is completed. And OECD has continued to refine their criteria, and they're used across the board as evidence of what works, for whom, why, and under what circumstances. And this framework has been quickly applied and adapted to most areas of international development, including the media development. And as you can see here, you don't need to read all of this, but there are multiple, just as an illustration, multiple methodologies and tools for examining media pluralism, media viability, and media sustainability from the international development perspective. So we have everything from UNESCO's media viability indicator through IRIX's WIBE to Deutsche Welle Academy's framework. And with the definitions above, there is no single approach to measuring media availability and sustainability. So, for instance, this is the most famous framework that media development organizations work with. Deutsche Welle Academy developed further their original indicators, and they defined here the viability as the ability of media outlets and media landscapes to produce high-quality journalism in a sustainable way. So, what does it mean to produce high-quality journalism in a sustainable way, and how do we unpack this at the media development field? So indicators are designed to assess viability on three levels. So we look at the overall economic environment, that's the first macro level, and then we look at the structure of media markets, at potential revenue sources, meso, and then we have the micro level of the organization. And then on top of this, the matrix is analyzed through extended past political, economical, social, technological factor prism. And this is actually linking it both to OECD framework that we just saw and the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see already here why we are sometimes struggling with explaining sustainability and viability in simple terms and agreeing common framework for measuring the impact of it. And so different aspects of this matrix, again, you don't need to read all of this. It's an illustration how interconnected and multi-layered our interventions are. And this MEDA's research illustrates that all our interventions and programs within media development can be seen using a similar axis: economic viability, social, institutional, and technological sustainability. And in line with all of this that I have just presented, I'm sorry about the fast forward. Yes, our colleagues who are engaged in the PRIME consortium have developed a really nice media availability learning brief, and they agree that most practitioners believe the viability goes beyond financial viability, and that includes professional standards, for instance, in editorial independence and pluralism. And we will hear some of them speak here today. We will have in the first part of this session MDIF, InterNews, and Foundation Irondell. In addition to how practice translates concept of sustainability into work, here you can see some of the approaches. We will share this presentation, and all of these reports are referenced in our repository. So in addition to how practice translates concept of sustainability into work, we will also hear what we know about different layers of sustainability from most recent research. We have recently seen high-quality reports that reflect and analyze situation at the local level, from Zimbabwe to Bangladesh and Lebanon. And only in Lebanon, we have seen several studies that are dissecting both what has happened with previous sustainability interventions and what is seen as needed. And we can hear from Rula Mikhail about some of their findings about some of their findings a bit later. We're also working with excellent impact regional coordinators who are bringing lessons learned and knowledge to our resource page from Afghanistan to Georgia. We are also fortunate to see some excellent research on the regional level. Here it is, from West Africa, Media West Foundation for West Africa to Splice Media in Asia. And here you can see some of the conclusions from the most recent December Media Inflection Point research. We also have a video from Michal Esteban explaining more about this, and you can find links to this on our event page. And finally, we have global trends. Lots of excellent reports from Anya Schifrin at Columbia University to Martin Scott and Mary Myers at the University of East Anglia. Mary is our rapporteur today. We will also hear from Guilherme Canella about series of reports that UNESCO is publishing. And of course, we can't forget the consequences of the pandemic. And from this study of ICFJ and Tow Center, we can hear reinforced message over and over again that most small and medium-sized outlets, especially in fragile and developing markets, need support to survive. This is all, of course, reflected well in this comment from our own snapshot research that we've done together with IMS and Skies Media in Lebanon, that is actually questioning this notion of sustainability as something that we can measure. So when we look at all these lessons learned from practice and conclusions from different research practices, we are left with a question whether we should be looking at sustainability with all these different layers and dimensions and challenges that media field is facing at the moment. So should we be looking at them as measurable outcomes, or should sustainability be a guiding principle, a vision to strive for? And I will leave you with this question in hands of my brilliant colleagues who will give you their insights about what it means to support sustainable and viable future for journalism. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here today, and thank you all for dedicating some time to what we have to say. I will now hand it back to you, Tom. Tom will moderate this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mira. So I would now like to invite our speakers for the next section, who are Jason Lambert, Senior Director of Media Business at InterNews, Caroline Viermin, the General Director of Fundación Hirondelle, and, I hope via video link, Patricia Torres-Bird, Managing Director of Media Services at the Media Development Institute, Media Development Investment Fund, and Maria Ristic, the Executive Director of the Balkan Investigative Journalism Network. Patricia, I'd like to come to you first, if you're there. Welcome.
Hello.
So, Patricia, I would like to start by asking you, from the 25 years of investment that MDIF has had in terms of loans and capacity building in media organizations, can you share some of the success stories, as well as how you incorporate risk when you're deciding how to invest and where to invest?
Well, thank you. It's a great question. And first of all, thank you for including us in this conversation, which is really important. As you said, MDIF has been working for 25 years, and we have the luxury that our process includes a long-term approach to all of those that we support. Access to capital is very difficult for most journalists around the world, and so we take a very patient approach to due diligence, to really figure out where they work, what their market obstacles are. We understand very much that not only are there social, economic, political factors, but also the stage of development of each organization. And so by having a deep understanding, we create really long-term relationships built on trust that allow us, in the department that I work in, and as a whole for the entire organization, to provide technical and venture support for the long term. I will say that, the lessons learned are exactly what I've said long term, because as Mira very well pointed out, The climate is continuously changing. There's always something new that is happening, whether it's internal or external. And so you have to be able to be there and support the media organizations and pivot with them as they have to pivot. We're fortunate that, as you said earlier, we've been in 25 years of this. Our impact dashboard shows that, we're working with more than 100 media organizations for over 20 years. That really can prove very productive. Some of our clients showcase an increase in revenue of 205% and their reach by 190% over the long term of 5 years intervention with us. We cannot take credit for that, and we wouldn't. But it really is, I think, a showcase of the work that we do with all of the clients.
Thank you, Patricia. And in terms of how donors could adapt, evolve the way that they design media support, the grants that they give, as well as perhaps lessons for the wider media development community in how they understand viability and how they address it through their interventions, what would you say that we could do better collectively?
I think that's the question, the million-dollar question we're all trying to figure out, right? We would say that oftentimes assumptions are made about a market in general. And we really feel at MDIF that there isn't a one-size recipe that fits all. You can take two organizations in the same city, and their approach, their capacity, their ability to deliver will be drastically different because organizations are different. And so assumptions can tend to be dangerous. But I also want to highlight that we can't let those things impede innovation. And so I think everybody in this room will have heard one of my favorite phrases, right, which is, it won't work in my country. And I think we have to really approach that with a little bit of respect and understanding that there are great ideas from other parts of the world that can be incorporated, maybe not 100% in their whole. I always say, let's steal from a recipe that works. Is it advertising? Is it reader support? Is it editorial workflow? Each organization's needs are very, very unique. And one of the things that I would suggest, and I know that I'm speaking for MDIF, is a really good understanding of the market, understanding the advertising market, the population audience habits, really having a deep dive before interventions are designed, because the market really rules a lot of what an organization can and cannot do.
Thank you, Patricia. Jason, to come to you next, what are the main learnings from InterNews' programs and your approach to viability and sustainability?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for having us at this panel. So I think a lot of what we learn comes from really relates back to the scale of the problem that we have here. If we do things the way that we always did them, by having experts that would go to the countries that we care about and support, and to go and do media development work, we're not actually, in my view, we're not actually attacking the problem at the scale that it needs to be attacked. So a lot of my work, since I've joined InterNews about a year and a half ago, is focused on how we scale up this kind of work. We work, we get usually funding to work with a set of partners to reach a segment of audiences in a particular country. And one of the kind of ancillary requirements often is, and by the way, please try to make those media sustainable. In my view, we need to prioritize the sustainability side much more. We can fund media as to almost ad infinitum, but if we're not making them sustainable, we're not solving the problem. So my work has been within the media business team at InterNews has been very much to decentralize the work that we're doing. And Zoe, I think you mentioned about you're making sure that more of the knowledge, more of the work stays in country. That's super important. So we're trying to build up teams of media business advisors and experts in country, both in country and at regional level, that we can learn from. Also during COVID, when we can't travel so much, when we can't be present in country as much as we'd want to. And by that way, actually, we found some great expertise in country that we can build up and also learn from much more than I think we've done historically. Small things that we found also regarding this kind of work, like learnings in the last couple of years especially, are that, as Patricia said, we have to understand local markets. That's never more important than now in these shifting markets when there's so much changing. It's harder to work remotely than it is in person. It's harder to generate strong results when we're working from afar than when we're in person with organizations. The mode that we do this work in is also changed. So we work much more towards sprints rather than marathons because people's attention spans are not so strong when we're not there. And we focus much more on the why instead of just the what. We have to tell people why we're there and why we do this work.
So Jason, yeah. InterNews uses 16 different types of media to understand how to engage with them. Could you explain a bit about that approach and how that helps you decide what kind of support would be appropriate for different kinds of organizations?
Thanks, Tom. So InterNews doesn't yet use the 16 types. This was some research that we did in the middle of last year that was really a prototype. And it was all about how do we decentralize our work and help people in country do the work according to the way that we've learned how to do it from all these discussions and all this work that we do, but without them necessarily being experts in the work. So we developed a typology which is based on 16 types. The advantage of that is that it's enough granularity without being over confusing. And the idea there is then we could generate playbooks for each media type. So if you meet a media of this type, what are you actually supposed to look for? What's a common characteristic or a common problem with this type of media? So it's an inspiration, I think, that work rather than a Bible, and we're not trying to force it on anyone, but we're just saying we need to develop playbooks, and we need to, in order to do this work at a greater scale.
So Jason, quickly, we've heard about long-term support, understanding needs and markets. In terms of the way that donors design and make available grants, is there anything else you'd add to that list of perhaps how we can improve how media support is structured?
Yeah, I think regarding media viability, there's this big problem about not really knowing what is good achievement. So what we often do is we set targets for our work, and there's very little oversight from the donors, I think, in terms of whether or not that is a good target or an ambitious target, whether that's something we should be aiming for. So what we would like to see is that we can democratize that data among us, many of the players in this room and online as well, to have a better understanding of where we should all be heading. That's a big thrust of the Media Viability Accelerator that we're all working towards, and we have collaboration on that project with many organizations in this room, such as FOIO and IMS and others who are contributing really strongly to those ideas as well.
Thank you, Jason. Maria, dobrodošli. From your point of view, running the management training hub Journalift, can you tell us a bit more about how that has supported long-term viability of local organizations that are non-for-profits?
Thank you, Tom, and welcome to my living room. So thanks a lot really for the opportunity to discuss this, and Bear's story is focused on the region of the Western Balkans. For those who don't know, we are an organization that is running from Sarajevo projects in Southeast and Central Europe, and we do mostly investigative journalism. But this specific case actually illustrates also a good partnership between media development organizations. So Journalift, as you mentioned, is actually a joint effort of Bear and Thomson Media that now runs for more than 3 years, where we united our skills to improve the standards and businesses of local media in the Balkans. And we decided in particular to focus on local media for several reasons. One, we mentioned trust a lot so far, and this was, of course, one of the main reasons for us. Local media in the Balkans have much bigger audience trust and closer relationship with their communities than mainstream media. Other reason is obviously their access to funding is much more limited because their resources are very limited, so they rarely can fulfill the administrative demands of the donors. And third, very important for the situation where Western Balkans is is that their ownership structure is actually far more transparent and they're less influential by different political elites when it comes to decision making in editorial and business. So how we did this is basically Byrne was in charge of one stream and Thompson was in charge of the other stream. Byrne would support the editorial development, train staff and media outlets in quality, investigative journalism, digital rights, security. We also used a lot of technology and developed softwares to help them, for example, engage with communities, get different insights from their audience, etc. While the colleagues from Thomson were focusing on what they do the best, and that is actually to create different tailor-made business models and to help them to diversify revenue streams, help them to develop websites and different ways of technical assistance from payments to privacy policies and other areas of assistance. And basically, the idea behind this was to provide them more comprehensive assistance that is one tailor-made assistance. So we did for each media outlet an assessment before we designed their support, and this is something I think in line with what Patricia was saying before. So we checked what was their need and in which area they would be the most successful. Then we didn't just give them a grant and provide them training, but we actually mentor them along the way. So we worked with them from the moment they would receive a grant until the end of the process. And that process usually lasted year and a half for each media outlet. And then third very important thing, and I think that proved quite important during COVID, is that we adjusted our plans along the way. So when the situation changed, we would also amend our plans, change focus, etc. So just in short, because I think I'm also running out of time, few key lessons from this is that what works is to focus on media trust and support media outlets that are credible and not look necessarily only into their reach and whether they reach large audiences, etc. So for us, Google Analytics was not the key measurement to success. Then also to be honest with the goals, and I'm sure that many of you know how dear and difficult situation is in the Western Balkans when it comes to media, and that is almost impossible to create sustainable media. So we didn't want to create an illusion that with this we did absolutely everything to make media sustainable. What we did is we helped them actually to just diversify their revenue stream and to be more, so to say, stronger players in the market. And then third, I think very crucial, and people mentioned that before me, and I'm sure that there will be discussion around this later, is to actually focus on long-term support. I think we have to really be aware that we cannot fix media scene with one-year project. So the actions need to be multi-year. This process is very slow, especially in the countries with authoritarian background. And also we need to be flexible. What is important in the year one doesn't necessarily need to be important in the year 5. What is important is that we keep track of what we are doing and actually adjust the action in line with the mission that we all say we're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I know something that stuck out from what you just said was about perhaps an outcome from the point of view of a donor is not achieving sustainability within one project, but is actually, you could measure, have they diversified their revenue streams? And that would be a much more realistic benchmark. Caroline, coming to you. Vanessa Herendel works in very difficult contexts. So how do you approach media sustainability and viability in conflict zones, in post-conflict zones where your organization does most of its work?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for inviting us. Indeed, we approach sustainability as a social responsibility. You know, you provide a service to people, you provide reliable information, it's a right, it's a fundamental right, and you cannot just stop from one day to the other because the funding from the donor has stopped. But working from very fragile context, it's not only the economic issue, it's all interrelated constraints from the political situation, the security situation, of course, the legal environment, and the corruption. So you want to create revenues, you want to create wealth, and it attracts even more problems. So for me, it's not so much an economic issue, it's actually a political question. Do we want independent media in this context where people need independent information? And so creating that enabling environment requires all stakeholders, not only the media sector, but also the donors, of course, the government, the authorities, to have a shared vision. And it's very rarely the case. Because the market cannot make it all and should not in many, many places. So what we have experienced in Central African Republic, in the DRC, in Mali, is that you really have to start with small-scale ambitions. Creating an advertising agency in Bangui, Central African Republic. We have one since 2010. You have to be very pragmatic. At some point, we were able to generate revenue from commercial advertising. Then the civil war in 2013 happened. None of the advertisers were willing or even in capacity to advertise. So the agency turned to strategic communication and campaigns and public service announcements and UN agencies. They are not the same clients. They require proposals, they require log frames, they require not only a commercial transaction, but they want results, they want impact. You don't have your marketing people ready to deliver that. So you have to continuously adapt to these needs. And of course, it slows down the revenue or the capacity of the revenue you can generate. Also, in this fragile context, you want to go with a media that will legally be rather a non-profit association type. So it does not go again with the corruption problem, taxes to pay to the government and all of that. But then if you're non-profit, MDIF will not invest, or capital will not come and shareholders will not come and take part because you're not a commercial entity. So you're stuck. And every time you have to balance these decisions. We said it already, long-term vision. Looking at the social element of the media, is it worth it to sustain this media? What is its role in the community, in the country, for social cohesion, for democracy, for development? Of course, institutional viability and sustainability. Who owns the media? What is its governance? Who decides from the independence of the newsroom to managing and hiring people? And the economic factors. And it was mentioned by Mira, there is a lot of review of studies, and the most recent one by Michel Leroy is very interesting because he talks about a common trajectory of all the actors. And very often that's missing from the government point of view or from the UN. Fondation Hirondelle has worked with many UN radios, Radio Kapi in the DRC, Miraya FM in South Sudan. There is no shared vision of what these media should become, their trajectory in the long term, and so you cannot move on and have realistic goals. So, if I may, some recommendations for the donors and the partners. We need to see long-term and in fragile contexts, but in many contexts today, because fragility really can come at any time, let's be flexible and not underestimate the external factors and constraints against viability, political change. human resources turnover within a media. You train people, you train managers, you train marketers, and they go for a UN post or for a communication post or for any other post where they will be better paid and have a better long-term view. The economic crisis, of course, the pandemic, all these things happen. They are not, of course, foreseen. You do a risk assessment, but many more problems occur. And for me, if we talk about sustainability and viability of journalism, yes, we need individuals, we need journalists. They have to be safe and be able to work safely. They have to be trained. But if we don't provide them media where they can work, a professional environment where they can professionally, sorry to say that way, do that independent journalism, the whole system will remain very vulnerable and fragile. So I think it was said this morning, many of the journalists are now freelancers. They do not benefit from a media as an organization, as an employer, and that's for me a way that makes the viability of the sector even more difficult. And a last point is, and it was said already, don't partners, donors, investors, don't ask us the viability of a project or a media 2 years at the end of the project. Come back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years after your investment and come check what remains. Maybe the media closed, but maybe the journalists went to work elsewhere, or the citizens and the audiences got savvy for independent and quality information, and that's a lasting result.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you also to Maria, to Patricia, and to Jason for some very rich contributions. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Now, turning to what we know from research, I'd like to invite Guido de Souza from UNESCO to rejoin us, as well as Claire Cook from International Media Support, Lars Tallett from Folio Media Institute, and hopefully via video link, Nadine Girat from Deutsche Welle Academy, and Rula Mikkel from Maharat Foundation. Guilherme, I'll come to you first, because I know you have to get to another meeting. Now, UNESCO has published a variety of publications recently on media viability. Could you walk us through some of them, and what are the key highlights you want to bring to our attention?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for everyone to be here. That's, as I said in the beginning, a fascinating and super important discussion. First, I just wanted to mention, before going to the newest set of publications, that we have a long history, not only UNESCO, most of us here, discussing these issues, and I think it's important to not forget what we have learned with the past discussion about issues that we maybe now are calling media viability, but through this history, we have already learned a lot of lessons. And for instance, the UNESCO, through the entire history of the organization, have always underlined the importance of public service broadcasters and have published extensive research on how to support this important component of the media system. And obviously this is also about media viability. And real public service broadcasters are dying as well, so we need to pay attention on this. When we first approved the original Windhoek Declaration, when we talk about free, independent, and pluralistic media, at the end of the day, we are also speaking about a viable media system. If we don't have that, we don't have pluralistic media. Then the IPDC program, UNESCO, with the Deutsche Welle Academy have discussed many years ago this idea of media viability indicators. So another tool that was out there. More recently, in the World Press Freedom Day 2020, we have this motto in the Netherlands, media without fear or favor, where we were discussing the risks of media capture connected with this current situation of the crisis in the media system, and underlining that any strategies, policies, etc., related to media viability should pay a lot of attention on the necessary safeguards that needs to come again together with those strategies to protect the editorial independence of the media. Because as we know, we can have more money flooding in this area, but this money might come with strings attached. And this is also a risk for freedom of expression. So just to say that I'm now going to mention a few new research, but this is learning a lot from this path dependence of the last 75 years in UNESCO discussing these several elements. So last year in the World Press Freedom Day, we discussed this idea that information is a public good, and we discussed three main concepts. One of them, media viability, that is convening us here today, but the other two elements of the Windhoek Plus 30 declaration that was later endorsed by our member states are also important for this discussion. The transparency of the internet companies is fundamental to gather evidence to understand what we can do in the media viability side. One of our problems today to discuss all these issues is that we simply don't know what's exactly going on in Facebook, Google, and the others, and what are their role in this entire story of the crisis of the media system. We know a little bit, but since there are lots of obscure elements in this discussion, we need to know more to produce evidence-based policy. And the other aspect of the Windhoek Plus 30 declaration, media and information literacy, is also fundamental to the discussion of media viability, because if the public don't trust the media system, if the public, the citizens, and therefore the voters, they don't demand that media viability should be in the agenda of the politicians, we don't move forward with this agenda. So media viability is spelled out like that in the Windhoek Plus 30 declaration, but transparency and media and information literacy are vital to this discussion. So based in this framework, safeguards, media capture, the information as a public good, we have then set a series of different research approaches. One of them led here by FPU. Leon is here, so when I leave, he can also complement what FPU has been doing for us. Trying to understand this situation in 10 specific countries, very diverse: Indonesia, Pakistan, Tunisia, Lebanon, Senegal, Nigeria, Namibia, Brazil, El Salvador, and Jamaica. And the first conclusion of this is that one size does not fit all. I mean, we are talking here about global solutions for media viability, but obviously we need to pay attention that those different markets, different situations will require specific policies to tackle this issue. And even when we talk about the algorithmic problem of the big internet platforms companies, and this is one of the key results of what FPU has done, is that this algorithmic situation impacts differently different media companies because of language issues, etc. So the way the traffic is sent, etc. So this is a very important result of that. Another component of this strategy is that we have produced a case study book that is authored by Larry Kilman on good practices in this area. So Larry researched situations in many countries, trying to see what is working in specific situations. Obviously, from that, it's impossible to scale up for a global policy, but there are interesting lessons learned in looking into these different cases. I'm almost finishing. We have also hired the Economist Intelligence Group to look in the same countries that FPU looked, but from a more, let's say, data-driven perspective in the advertisement market and so on and so forth. And they also have produced a very interesting, strong report with data from the economic perspective of this issue, trying to look in solutions in terms of taxes and so on and so forth. And this report, produced by the Economist Intelligence Group, will be released soon, mid-March. And finally, the World Trends Report, which the main chapter is called Journalism as a Public Good, also is looking into these issues. So how we keep this idea of journalism as a public good, paying attention in the long history of the economic science, studying several public goods, not only journalism or information, how we can learn from this study of how we fund public goods, and at the same time, keep things like editorial independence. So this is what we are doing as UNESCO, with the main goal in the immediate future, in the World Press Freedom Day, that the global celebration will be Uruguay. We are going to publish a policy brief summarizing all of that. And this policy brief will then try to actually spell out concrete recommendations for the different stakeholders, particularly trying to suggest some policy avenues to address this problem. Thanks.
Thank you, Guilherme. And the publications that are already available, you can find all of them on the GFMD Impact resource space. That's impact.gfmd.info. And also there, you'll find Claire Cook's 15-minute video, which looks into, seamless segue, which looks into action research as a viability strategy. So I encourage you to please go and find that video. Claire, in the time that we have, could you explain a bit about that approach?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for having us here. At International Media Support, we're really interested in the granularity of learning from partners in the context and with the challenges that they're facing. And what action research is allowing us to do is take a systematic process to learning what works on the ground and potentially amplifying that where that is appropriate. Action research is very much about leaning on local knowledge, getting local buy-in with partners, building local coalitions and sharing knowledge. And that's why it is a great strategy for avoiding pockets of innovation and pockets of viability. And we've had some great successes, actually, where we've been able to look, for example, at running short-term sprints or trials on tools. We've found cases where different partners in different contexts are actually facing similar challenges. And as a media development organisation, we've been able to step in and take some of the heavy lifting around answering those questions for organisations that are time poor and resource poor. So there's a role to play there. There's also a role in terms of solutions-orientated thinking and experimentation, which is a luxury that many of our partners don't have if they tried to do that on their own. And action research can come in terms of workshopping, design thinking, testing tools, and be a great way to sort of amplify that knowledge. I think the takeaway from learning this is, first of all, really focusing on cross-cutting thematics. Now, whether they're the challenge of reader revenues in fragile contexts and whether that's even an option, whether that is really putting a spotlight on the gaps in data from analytics and VPN use, and how to actually make sense of data and decision-making in your organisation when you're faced with those challenges, whether that's workflows, when you're in exile and you're having to rapidly adjust your operations and your workflows. There are cross-cutting thematics. And even as an organisation at IMS that is structured fundamentally around place-based development, even at the organisation level, identifying those cross-cutting themes is a challenge. So as a sector, I think we need to think more seriously about how we can do this and actually take those themes, whether it is about making sure organisations don't fall further behind in terms of AI or other things for the digital frontrunners, or whether it's finding low-cost public interest solutions and infrastructures such as podcasting or website solutions for those perhaps transitioning from community radio elsewhere. But that's the thinking, and it really speaks to our business viability strategy that's been built around 6 pillars. And what that allows us to do is look at strengthening organisations so that capacity building becomes part of their competitive advantage. It might speak to having armies of audiences that, you know, support that media organisation in different ways, or it could be about investigative journalism. We have a great project called Media Bridge, which is trying to take stories from the Global South and connect them with the Global North. But these are all experimentations, and they allow us to really find out what works for whom, when and where, with a focus on the detail.
Claire, could you just go into a bit more detail about, you know, perhaps the need, especially on this subject, to allow for innovation, to allow for things not to work, and that process is actually a positive one and should be embraced? And perhaps if you could add to some of the guidance or suggestions that have been given in terms of how donors structure the funding that they give in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of this is about being agile. That's agile in thinking, in leadership, in product development, and productization sounds really scary, but you know that's just newsletters. It could be newsletters, it could be pivots to podcasts, it could be a different revenue model, and working out whether or not that would work for you in this context. So that notion of agile, I think, is really important. And supporting that as an agent for change, I think, is really important. Your second question was?
In terms of adding to what's been said already, in terms of advice, guidance we could give to those who support.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Just to remind me, I think it's really important that there's been talk about you know, a collaborative media development lab. This word lab, studio, action research, that they're all really about putting the emphasis on experimentation, on allowing media organisation to fail and making sure that that failure is captured. It also speaks to entrepreneurial spirit, which is something that is very difficult to quantify, but is a really big differential in what Patricia was saying, why in one city even, one organisation can have a very different strategy to another. And this notion of entrepreneurialism and making the best of what we have, which is bricolage theory, is really important for media developments to support in terms of some sort of lab or studio where we can all work on this together.
Thank you, Claire. And I hope that GFMD Impact can play a role in bringing together those experiences, the failures as well as the successes. Lars, I'd like to come to you now. Now, FOYO's approach to media viability and sustainability goes far beyond financial viability. And could you explain a bit about how this approach could be integrated into other aspects of media development and touch upon what the implications might be for the design of media support?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Well, I'm here representing GFMD as a member of the GFMD Policy and Learning Committee, but my daily work is at the FOYO Media Institute at the Linnaeus University. And FOYO, we have been around for 50 years, but we're actually a newcomer here with GFMD. I'm extremely happy to be part of this wonderful crowd. We are an odd bird. We are an odd bird at the Linnaeus University because we are practitioners. Most of us, like me, are former journalists, fully integrated in a public university. Now, this may seem odd, but it's actually an ideal position if you want to do media development, because we are at the crossroad of, on the one hand, media practice and the newsroom, and on the other hand, the academia. So we can build bridges between research and practice. And we are much engaged here in the Nordic countries and Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So just to give you a picture of where I come from. And now to answer your question there, or try to answer, I'll give you a little different approach, not to repeat all the good and wise things that have been said. But our approach on media viability and media sustainability goes beyond the scope as financial viability and sustainability. We see media viability and sustainability as concepts that need to be integrated in all aspects of media development. And even more, we see journalists, independent journalism, not only as a pillar of democracy, but we also believe that media development has the potential to enable environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable society. So this is what we call sustainable journalism. To clarify what I mean, I'll give you kind of an overarching principle based on our 50 years of experience and research. It's like a conclusion we've come to, and it's a simple principle. Make sure that all support is carried out in close cooperation with local partners, focusing support on their capacity to improve their media business in a broad sense, assisting them to become economically sustainable, while at the same time enabling environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable societies. I'll give you one example from Bangladesh, where we had the possibility to work with some of the major media companies. And it was a huge endeavor, because what we did was basically, together with our Bangladeshi partners, we cooperated with the media organizations, and on a long-term basis. We have been doing this for 5 years. And the aim was to optimize the media organizations, not only to make better investigative journalism, but actually to optimize the entire organization, from the marketing department to the newsroom to the reporters in the field, to make them better fit to producing quality journalism, while at the same time improving profitability and trust in journalism. And this program has led to an increase of the number and quality of investigative journalism stories in Bangladesh, especially on stories related to gender and climate. And as my last point, I know we're supposed to communicate results, but I promise I'll do that in 1 year's time. But I just want to tell you about our biggest research project yet. And it involves 7 universities and a big number of media houses, where we investigate the relation between journalism, sustainability, and transformation of society, connecting it to the Agenda 2030, where I think the media development has been kind of confined to 1610. We always talk about 1610, 1610, but the role of journalism is to keep people in power to account. They have to keep the promises they made in the Agenda 2030 and in the Paris Agreement, and now within COP26. That's the role of journalism. So let's get out of 1610.
Thank you, Lars.
Yeah.
Well, we have to move on now, so we have time to speak to Nadine and Rula, but thank you for that contribution. Nadine, thank you for waiting online to speak to us. Now, I'd like you to tell us a bit about Deutsche Welle Academy's viability sprints and how you've used the media viability indicators in that work.
Yes, thank you so much for having me and for sharing my experiences and learning from the other experts. We realized that with a lot of media organizations that we work with, they don't have time to think strategy. And I think Mira was saying earlier that it's a very complex concept, media viability, and we've been trying to bring it across in very simple terms and to make it fun as well and interactive. So we've developed the V sprints, the viability sprints, to really get the whole team behind this concept and also understand how the different aspects all connect with each other. That quality journalism can mean business, that knowing your audience is very, very important to build trust, and how even other professionals, financial, admin, sometimes legal professionals, depending the context that you work in, are very, very important for your business.
Thank you. I was wondering, could you also explain some of your main viability priorities and what areas did this work identify?
Yes, as the others have said, there's no one size fits all. In every media organization, even two in the same city, we've had that experience as well, have different challenges. But what we try and do is really understand the context that they work in, the political context, the economic context. And we spend a lot of time also on the audience to really, for media managers, journalists, to really look at their audience or look at their media from the audience's point of view. So why should someone pay or pay attention to your media product? And to then really find ways of engaging with the audience, because even if they can't pay, which obviously is the case in many countries that we work in, they might still be able to support you in a different way. And in some countries, like Mexico, for example, or even Lebanon or the Philippines, we saw a real connection between audience trust and safety, for example. Because safety, especially digital safety, is an aspect that many are underestimating, but that can ruin your business and your media, and the trust that your audience or your sources might have in you can destroy your media business. So these are some of the main aspects that we've seen, the real connection between safety and viability and the focus on the audience.
Thank you. My last question to you is, do you have any cautionary tales, or as others have already given some examples of how media support to sustainability and viability can be better structured and better designed? Do you have anything to add or anything you'd like to emphasize that's been mentioned already?
Yes, I think what we've seen is a bit which goes into the same direction as the others. I think we see a real change in mindsets with the media organizations or the people working for the media organizations that we've been working with. Many of them are ex-journalists who've set up their own media organization because they were very frustrated with their old newsrooms. And they are realizing that other professionals, legal, admin, bookkeeping, can be just as important. So my advice would be, or what we hear from them, is to really also support to provide core funding to support these costs that are important for media as a business, to allow experimenting, to allow for failure, and to really foster this entrepreneurship of entrepreneurial thinking. And for those that don't have them, to give them support to really get into that state of mind in a way. And the other thing I think that's important, and this is what we've tried to do with our media viability indicators, we as a community need to find a common language, because only then we know what to tackle, we know what a good goal might be, and we know what we need to understand in order to support media viability. So just as the reference we usually have is climate change or the climate crisis, there's a very clear language now. There are very clear criteria and goals. And this is something that we really need in the case of media viability as well, I think.
Thank you, Nadine. And I would recommend the report that Larry Kilman did for UNESCO about some personal stories about how journalists went from being focused on their journalism to moving, failing, learning to create a business. Some really interesting, inspirational stories in there. Rula, thank you so much for waiting. We're very pleased that you've joined us. Could you tell us a bit about the evidence from the research done by Maharat and partners into the viability of startups and alternative media in Lebanon? What are your main findings?
Thank you, Tom, for having me today with you. Of course, I will be happy to share with the audience today what was our main findings through the previous year. So Maharat, in the previous years, we produced 4 studies to be informed us on the media ecosystem and challenges of viability in Lebanon. So one of our studies was called Mapping Media Startup in Lebanon, including refugee platforms. One main findings was that asserted our acknowledgement that viability cannot only be looked at from the business model perspective, as there are many other challenges in a context such as Lebanon that should be looked at. Another studies called Media Trends in Time of Change that Maharat did after 17th of October and the protestation here in Lebanon. And one of the main findings was that the discourse of alternative media platforms was way more progressive than the mainstream media. It broke taboos, it gave more spaces to women and marginalized communities, including refugees. They have built a more fact-based narrative regarding the economic situation and the many crises faced in Lebanon, unlike the mainstream media that are captured by the interest of politicians, businessmen, and sponsored by banks who are a main of the conflict. Also, another study called Media Information Ecosystem Landscape, and we did it from an audience perspective. Our main findings was that audiences are not very familiar with an alternative media platform, but they showed openness to start engaging with these platforms and build the trust relation. Even if they still like watching TV and consuming news covered by the television, but they showed openness to start build, as I said, this relationship with the new alternative media. Also, we provided in the last 2 years technical assistance for 15 alternative media platforms in Lebanon. Some of them having a national focus with innovative and progressive content, others more with more local focus, focusing on news from Tripoli or from Shuf, who are a region far away from the capital here in Lebanon. And other also new media startup focusing on refugees issues or in people with disabilities. Our approach is evidence-based, where our studies serve our interventions. What we have been doing is starting with a needs assessment before providing any assistance. Also with our cooperation with international media development agency like InterNews or also like Deutsche Welle, we used their tools to really assist this news alternative platform. For example, we used the sprint tool, the 5 sprint tool developed by Deutsche Welle Academy, and we complemented with a media monitoring of the content of the platforms in order to identify the gaps in quality of content, especially related to journalism professional standard or ethics or lack of editorial skills. So our solutions are based on our understanding of context and the market, where our experts work with the platforms to have specific missions and visions and drive them through the business plan process to identify their niche, while other content experts also work with them to improve their production so that can produce relevant content that is user-centered and serving their communities. As well, we also used another tool with collaboration with InterNews.
Your last point. Quick, thank you. Could you just finish that last point and we'll have to wrap up?
Yes, sorry, Tom.
Could you just finish the last point and we'll have to move on to the conclusion? Thank you.
Okay, so and as other speakers, so I will be sharing quickly our main findings. So in countries like Lebanon, where media is captured, it's very, very important to support and dependent voices, providing alternative and diverse discourse with a long-term support. So I'm joining other like expert to say any support for media, new media alternative should be for long term in order to allow them to grow.
Thank you, Rula.
And
I hope that message is heard loud and clear about the need for long-term support. We'll have to wrap it up there, but thank you so much, Rula, Nadine, Guilherme, Lars, and Claire for all of your insights. We really appreciate it. I'd now like to invite Mary Myers, who's going to be our rapporteur for this session, to help us to conclude. And if there's anyone who'd like to make a comment, we have microphones in the room, so do please raise your hands. We have less than 10 minutes before the end, so I'd please invite you to make them short and sweet if you can. Mary, thank you so much for playing this role. We've had a very rich session, and I wouldn't expect you to summarize all of it, but what is your impression of where we are as a sector in terms of understanding the challenges faced by sustainability and viability, and also in terms of finding solutions that work in different contexts? How do you, from what you've heard today, where do you think we are?
Well, I'm super impressed. I mean, it's incredible how much work's been done over the last 10 or so years to find solutions to this big conundrum of sustainability. And as Mira said, it's the Holy Grail. I mean, so many amazing bits of research, deep thinking, but also concrete projects on the ground. But I'd just like to kind of put this in context of this whole event that we're here at, which is about media freedom. And of course, it's so great that this session is about the other side of the coin. To me, the two big problems for media is on one side, sustainability, and then the other side is freedom. And it when I was just listening to all these people here, it took me back to my own research, my recent research on sustainability for small radio stations in East Africa. I was at a radio station in northern Uganda called Radio Tembo, and we were talking about revenue, diversification and stuff. And then the director turned to me and said, actually, all that doesn't matter because we don't know whether tomorrow the police are just going to come in and kick our doors down or put a padlock on the transmitter and we just will be off air. And so for her, of course, you know, viability was of paramount importance, but so was freedom. So it's so good that this is the first session of this conference here. And also it's so good that I think donors and people who are involved intimately with the coalition can hear this discussion and engage with it because of the fact that media freedom has actually been quite narrowly defined by the coalition so far. It hasn't really engaged, I don't think. I mean, there's a precursor to the later session where I'm going to be talking about our own evaluation of the Media Freedom Coalition. But, you know, I think this whole challenge of sustainability is now of paramount importance to the whole debate around freedom. But so much good thinking, as I was saying, great toolkits, great research, it sounds like. I suppose perhaps if there are some sort of 4 or 5 kind of themes that keep coming back, it's about, in terms of approaches to promoting sustainability, it's flexibility, it's long-term thinking, it's the importance of research, not just about your audiences, but about strategies, revenue diversification, markets, so on. That the audience is king, not just about who is listening, who is watching, or who is potentially paying, but also their trust, which is so important to the long-term viability in the community of listeners or viewers, readers, that local solutions and decentralization, very important, and then exchange of learning is very, very key. So GFMD is that convener.
We're doing our best, and the GFMD Impact Initiative is exactly trying to play that role, to bring together donors and academics, as well as media development organizations who are our members, to have these discussions. And what I found very interesting from your comments, Mary, is that they lead us very nicely to our next session, looking at principles. I was hearing things, long-term, understanding needs in different countries being essential, flexibility, allowing for innovation. And these are all things we're going to pick up in the next session, looking at renewing the principles for effective media development. Now, I have one comment from online, which I'll read out in a second. But is there anyone in the room who would like to make a quick comment or a question, or perhaps even identify an area that you would like GFMD to go into more detail on in the future? Jan Lubinsky from DW Academy.
Yeah, thanks. Nadine, who just spoke, somehow lost the connection, but there's one thing she wanted to mention.
Could you just take off your mask a second? Do you mind?
No, I don't. Nadine Jurand, who just spoke, lost her connection, and she messaged me saying that one thing that she thinks is of crucial importance is that we foster the dialogue south to south on media viability. So it's not the northern experts who come and know how things are done, but that we should run exchanges and, so people can learn from each other. That's the point she wanted to make.
Thank you, Jan, and we'd absolutely agree with that. And I think one of the things we can perhaps learn from how these conferences are organized is that it does tend to be easier for the northern-based, slightly more wealthy organizations to attend. And perhaps something that the Media Freedom Coalition could look into for future conferences is to have, a larger fund to try and get journalists, media development organizations, so more of our members who work on a national level in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. So they're not just dialing in and just there for the 5 minutes we can hear from them, but actually they can be here for the whole of the conference. I know that happens, but I think we can definitely redouble our efforts to do that. Are there any other comments or questions in the room before we wrap up? Just to say, we will be doing a write-up of this. It's going to be available on YouTube, so you can watch it back if you missed anything. The one comment that we had online under the YouTube chat was from Dennis Chabrol, who is joining us from Guyana, South America, and he has said there needs to be investment in a trust fund for independent media, so the proceeds can be used to fund media. Dennis, I suggest you tune in at 6 Tallinn time, Eastern European time, for the session on the International Fund for Public Interest Media. I think that would be right up your street, Dennis, so do tune in for that. Thank you to everyone who has spoken. Thank you to everyone who's joined online and who's been here. Please visit impact.gfmd.info to find out more about this initiative, to join our newsletter so you can make sure that you are aware of future meetings, and you'll also be able to find the literature that's been mentioned today and many other resources. So thank you all very much. We'll have a 15-minute break. We're going to start again looking at renewing the principles for effective media development, media support, and we hope you will be back very soon to join us. Thank you all. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.